Lima, Peru, August 14th, 2018. The pediatric ward at Hospital Nacional 2 de Mayo falls silent as 4-year-old Santiago Morales whispers something that freezes every nurse within earshot. They threw me from the sacred mountain because I knew too much about the gods. The child's mother, Carmen Morales, drops the juice box she was holding. Her hands tremble as she stares at her son, who just moments before had been coloring pictures of cartoon characters like any normal preschooler. But Santiago isn't looking at her with the innocent eyes of a child anymore. His gaze carries something ancient, something impossibly old for someone who hasn't even started kindergarten. The attending physician, Dr. Elena Vasquez, approaches the bed cautiously. She has worked with children for 15 years and has seen everything from night terrors to psychological trauma. But nothing in her medical training prepared her for what Santiago says next. I remember the cold stones under my feet when they made me kneel at the edge. The condors were waiting below to carry my spirit to the Sun Father. Carmen feels the room spinning around her. How could her 4-year-old son know about condors? They live in an apartment in central Lima, hundreds of kilometers from the Andes. Santiago has never seen a condor except maybe in a picture book. What you are about to hear challenges everything we understand about memory, consciousness, and the very nature of human existence. This is the story of a child who claims to remember dying in one of the most sacred places on Earth, 5 centuries before he was born. A story that would lead archaeologists to discoveries that rewrote history books and forced scientists to question the boundaries between life and death. But that August morning in the hospital was only the beginning of something that would shake the foundations of everything Carmen thought she knew about her son. Santiago had been admitted 3 days earlier after a severe asthma attack that left him unconscious for 18 hours. When he finally opened his eyes, he wasn't the same child who had been rushed to the emergency room. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Gone was the shy boy who could barely string together complete sentences in Spanish. In his place sat someone who spoke with the gravity of an adult, using words that no 4-year-old should know. During those first 48 hours after waking, Santiago remained eerily quiet, studying every face, every corner of the hospital room with an intensity that made the medical staff uncomfortable. It was Dr. Vasquez who first noticed that something fundamental had changed. The child observed everything with the calculating gaze of someone much older, as if he were trying to understand where he was and how he had arrived there. When nurses entered his room, Santiago would watch them with a mixture of confusion and recognition, as though he expected to see different people entirely. The first truly disturbing incident occurred on the morning of August 16th. Carmen was helping Santiago eat breakfast when he suddenly pushed the plate away and declared with absolute conviction, "I cannot eat this food. In my mountain home, we ate only what the Earth Mother provided. Quinoa, potatoes blessed by the priests, and sacred corn that grew in terraces carved by our ancestors." Carmen stared at her son in complete bewilderment. Santiago had never heard of quinoa, had never shown any interest in vegetables, and certainly had never spoken about ancestors or priests. His favorite foods had always been chicken nuggets and chocolate milk, typical fare for any preschooler in Lima. But what happened next left Carmen questioning her own sanity. Santiago began drawing on the paper the nurses had provided for his entertainment. These weren't the typical scribbles of a 4-year-old child. With surgical precision, he drew detailed architectural plans of stone structures, complete with staircases, terraces, and ceremonial platforms. His small hands moved across the paper with the confidence of an experienced architect, creating proportionally accurate diagrams that showed sophisticated understanding of ancient construction techniques. Dr. Vasquez documented everything, taking photographs of each drawing while trying to maintain her professional composure. When she showed the sketches to her colleague, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, who specialized in child psychology, his reaction was immediate and alarming. "Elena, these drawings show knowledge of Incan architecture that even university students struggle to master. Look at these proportions, these engineering details. This child has drawn what appears to be a ceremonial complex, with astronomical alignments that require advanced mathematical understanding. The psychological evaluation that followed raised even more questions than it answered. Santiago submitted to the tests with patient compliance, but his responses defied every established pattern of child development. When shown pictures of various animals, he correctly identified not only common pets and farm animals, but also species native to the Andes that most urban children would never encounter. He knew the difference between vicuñas and llamas, could describe the hunting patterns of Andean condors, and spoke about chinchillas as if he had personally cared for them. But the most chilling moment came when Dr. Rodriguez presented Santiago with a photograph of Machu Picchu taken from a standard tourist angle. The child's reaction was immediate and visceral. He began to tremble, his eyes filled with tears, and he pressed his small hands against the image as if trying to touch something beyond the photograph. "That is my home," he whispered in a voice thick with longing. "I lived there when the stones sang with the voices of our ancestors. I was chosen to serve the Sun Temple, to interpret the messages written in shadows and light." Carmen watched her son with growing horror as he continued describing details about the ancient citadel that no 4-year-old should possibly know. He spoke about the precise positioning of certain buildings, the purpose of various ceremonial spaces, and the daily routines of priests who had died centuries before Columbus ever set sail for the Americas. Every word Santiago uttered was delivered with the unwavering certainty of someone recounting personal memories rather than fantasies or stories heard from others. Dr. Rodriguez attempted to rationalize what he was witnessing. Perhaps the child had been exposed to educational programs about Incan civilization, or maybe he had overheard adult conversations about Peru's archaeological heritage. But Carmen firmly denied any such exposure. They lived in a working-class neighborhood where conversations revolved around jobs, bills, and neighborhood gossip, not ancient history. Their television was limited to children's cartoons and soap operas. Santiago had never visited a museum, never owned books about archaeology, and had certainly never been exposed to academic discussions about pre-Columbian cultures. The hospital staff began referring to Santiago's case in hushed whispers. Word spread quickly through the pediatric ward that something extraordinary was happening in room 237. Nurses found excuses to check on the child, not for medical reasons, but out of sheer curiosity about the boy who claimed to remember living in Machu Picchu. Some were skeptical, dismissing his statements as elaborate fantasies. Others were genuinely disturbed by the specificity and consistency of his accounts. But Santiago wasn't finished revealing the impossible depth of his memories. On his 4th day in the hospital, he began speaking about his death in that previous life, with a matter-of-fact tone that sent chills through everyone who heard him. The description he provided was so detailed and emotionally charged that even the most skeptical staff members found themselves questioning their assumptions about the nature of consciousness and memory. What no one in that hospital room could have predicted was that Santiago's revelations were about to attract the attention of some of Peru's most respected archaeologists and historians. Within days, his case would become the subject of intense scientific scrutiny and would ultimately lead to archaeological discoveries that would challenge everything experts thought they knew about the final days of the Incan Empire. Santiago's descriptions became increasingly specific and disturbing as the days passed. On August 18th, during what should have been a routine medical check, he provided details about his alleged execution that left the medical team in stunned silence. "They bound my hands with rope made from llama hair," he said, while Dr. Vasquez examined his breathing. "The priests wore golden masks that reflected the morning sun, and their eyes were filled with sadness because they knew I spoke the truth about the coming destruction." Carmen gripped the metal rail of the hospital bed until her knuckles turned white. Her son continued speaking in that same unnaturally mature voice, describing ceremonial rituals and religious practices with the precision of someone who had witnessed them firsthand. The most terrifying aspect wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Santiago spoke about his own death with the detached calm of a historian recounting ancient events, showing no fear or trauma that would be expected from a child discussing something so violent. The breaking point came when Santiago began speaking in what sounded like a different language entirely. Dr. Vasquez immediately stopped her examination and called for Dr. Rodriguez. The child was muttering phrases that contained sounds and rhythms completely foreign to Spanish, yet he spoke with the same fluency he used for his native tongue. Carmen had never heard anything like it, and neither had any of the hospital staff. Dr. Rodriguez arrived within minutes and began recording Santiago's vocalizations on his phone. What he captured would later be identified by linguistic experts as fragments of Quechua, the ancient language of the Incan Empire, but not modern Quechua spoken by contemporary Andean communities. Santiago was using archaic forms and pronunciations that had been extinct for centuries, variants that existed only in the most obscure academic texts studied by specialized researchers. The recordings were immediately sent to Dr. Patricia Huaman at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, one of Peru's leading experts in pre-Columbian languages. Her response arrived via email less than 6 hours later, and her words sent shockwaves through the hospital's administration. The child is speaking classical Quechua, with dialectical variations specific to the Cusco region during the late imperial period. The pronunciation patterns and grammatical structures he uses correspond to linguistic forms that disappeared before 1600. This is impossible unless he has had extensive academic training in historical linguistics. But Santiago's linguistic abilities were only the beginning of revelations that would soon attract national attention. News of the unusual case began circulating through Lima's medical community, and within days, journalists were calling the hospital requesting interviews. Carmen found herself overwhelmed by the sudden media attention, struggling to understand how her son's mysterious condition had become a public spectacle. The situation escalated dramatically when Dr. Carlos Mendoza, director of Peru's National Institute of Archaeology, personally visited the hospital on August 22nd. Dr. Mendoza had spent his entire career studying Incan civilization and had excavated sites throughout the Sacred Valley. He arrived at Hospital Nacional 2 de Mayo with profound skepticism, expecting to debunk what he assumed was either an elaborate hoax or a case of childhood fantasy run amok. What he encountered instead challenged every assumption he had formed during his 30-year career. Santiago looked directly at Dr. Mendoza and, without any prompting, began describing specific architectural features of Machu Picchu that weren't visible in standard tourist photographs or mentioned in popular books about the site. He spoke about hidden chambers beneath the Temple of the Sun, about water channels that flowed through secret passages, and about ceremonial spaces that had been sealed off from public access for decades. Dr. Mendoza felt his scientific worldview crumbling as this 4-year-old child provided information that was known only to a handful of archaeologists who had spent years working at the site. Santiago described the exact positioning of astronomical markers, the purpose of seemingly insignificant stone formations, and the location of artifacts that had been discovered in restricted excavations never publicized to the general public. The most shocking moment came when Santiago pointed to a specific area on a detailed archaeological map that Dr. Mendoza had brought with him. There, beneath the platform of the ancestors, lies the chamber where they kept the golden discs that recorded our prophecies, the child said with absolute certainty. I helped carry those discs to their hiding place 3 days before the bearded men arrived from across the great water. Dr. Mendoza's hands trembled as he realized that Santiago had identified the exact location of a recently discovered cache of golden artifacts that had been found buried beneath what archaeologists called the ceremonial platform. The discovery had been made only 8 months earlier during a classified excavation, and the findings hadn't been announced to the public. The location was known to fewer than a dozen people worldwide, yet this child from Lima had pinpointed it with surgical precision. Carmen watched in bewilderment as her son continued providing information that seemed to astound the distinguished archaeologist. Santiago drew detailed sketches of ceremonial objects, described the daily routines of Incan priests, and recounted specific rituals that aligned perfectly with Dr. Mendoza's most recent research findings. Every detail was historically accurate, culturally appropriate, and consistent with archaeological evidence that had taken teams of experts years to uncover and interpret. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came when Santiago began describing the final days of Machu Picchu before its abandonment. He spoke about urgent preparations to hide sacred objects, about desperate ceremonies performed to appease angry gods, and about the terror that gripped the community as news arrived of Spanish conquistadors advancing through the empire. His account painted a vivid picture of a civilization in its death throes, struggling to preserve its most sacred knowledge before everything was lost forever. Dr. Mendoza realized he was witnessing something that transcended conventional explanation. This wasn't a case of childhood imagination or psychological trauma. Santiago was providing first-hand testimony about historical events that had occurred 5 centuries ago, delivered with the authority of someone who had personally experienced them. The implications were staggering and would soon attract the attention of researchers from around the world. The hospital room had become an impromptu archaeological consultation as Santiago continued revealing details about Incan religious practices, architectural techniques, and cultural traditions that matched perfectly with the most current academic understanding of the civilization. But even more disturbing was his emotional response to discussing these memories. When he spoke about the approaching Spanish conquest, tears streamed down his cheeks, and his voice carried a grief that seemed far too deep for a 4-year-old child to comprehend or express. What happened next would forever change how the scientific community viewed the boundaries between memory and consciousness. Dr. Mendoza made a decision that would either validate Santiago's impossible claims or expose them as elaborate fabrication. He arranged for the child to be transported to the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, where a team of specialists could conduct more comprehensive tests under controlled conditions. The journey from the hospital to the university on August 24th was tense with anticipation. Carmen held Santiago's hand tightly as they rode in Dr. Mendoza's vehicle through Lima's congested streets. Her son remained unusually quiet during the 40-minute drive, staring out the window with that same ancient expression that had become disturbingly familiar. Occasionally, he would murmur phrases in what Carmen now knew was archaic Quechua, speaking to invisible companions as if continuing conversations that had been interrupted centuries ago. Upon arrival at the university, Santiago was introduced to Dr. Rosa Villegas, a specialist in child psychology, who had been briefed about the case but remained deeply skeptical. Her carefully planned battery of tests was designed to expose any inconsistencies in Santiago's account or reveal the source of his seemingly impossible knowledge. What she discovered instead would haunt her for the remainder of her career. The first test involved showing Santiago photographs of various archaeological sites from around Peru, mixed with images from other South American locations and some completely unrelated ancient ruins from different continents. Without hesitation, the child correctly identified every authentic Incan site, while dismissing the others as foreign or irrelevant. But his responses went far beyond simple recognition. For each genuine Incan location, Santiago provided detailed commentary about its original purpose, its ceremonial significance, and specific architectural features that weren't visible in the photographs. When shown an aerial image of Ollantaytambo, Santiago immediately pointed to a section of terraced walls and declared, "The water priests lived in those chambers during the planting ceremonies. They would sing to the mountain spirits at dawn while the sacred coca leaves burned in the stone bowls." Dr. Villegas cross-referenced his description with archaeological reports and found that recent excavations had indeed uncovered evidence of ceremonial chambers in exactly the location Santiago had indicated, complete with burned coca residue dating to the late imperial period. The testing continued for hours, with Santiago demonstrating knowledge that defied rational explanation. He described the internal layout of buildings that had been buried for centuries, identified the purposes of mysterious stone structures that archaeologists were still debating, and provided insights into Incan religious practices that aligned perfectly with the most recent academic theories. Every answer was delivered with the confidence of someone recounting personal experiences rather than information learned from books or documentaries. Dr. Villegas found herself increasingly disturbed by the consistency and depth of Santiago's responses. There was no hesitation in his answers, no contradictions in his accounts, and no evidence of the kind of confabulation typically seen in children who create elaborate fantasy worlds. Instead, Santiago spoke about Incan civilization with the same natural ease that other children might discuss their neighborhood playground or their favorite television show. The most compelling test came when Dr. Mendoza produced a collection of authentic Incan artifacts that had never been publicly displayed or photographed for academic publications. These objects had been discovered in recent excavations and were known only to the archaeologists who had unearthed them. Santiago examined each piece with reverent care, handling them as if they were precious relics from his own past. When presented with a gold ceremonial knife decorated with intricate geometric patterns, Santiago's reaction was immediate and emotional. He cradled the artifact against his chest, while tears streamed down his face. "This belonged to the high priest Amaru," he whispered. "I watched him use it to cut the sacred llama's throat during the Inti Raymi ceremony. The blood flowed into channels carved in the altar stone, carrying our prayers to the Sun Father." His description of the ritual was so vivid and detailed that Dr. Mendoza felt as if he were witnessing the ceremony himself. The archaeological team quickly verified Santiago's account against historical records and discovered that a priest named Amaru had indeed served at Machu Picchu during the final decades of the Incan Empire. References to this individual appeared in Spanish colonial documents describing the conquest period, but such obscure historical details would be impossible for a 4-year-old child from Lima to access or understand. As the testing sessions continued over several days, Santiago's revelations became increasingly specific and verifiable. He described the exact locations of hidden caches of artifacts, provided detailed accounts of religious ceremonies that matched perfectly with archaeological evidence, and offered insights into daily life at Machu Picchu that filled gaps in scholarly understanding of Incan civilization. Each new piece of information he provided was subsequently verified by experts who had spent decades studying the culture. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Santiago's case wasn't the accuracy of his historical knowledge, but the emotional trauma he exhibited when discussing certain memories. When asked about the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, the child would become agitated and distressed, describing scenes of violence and destruction with a visceral intensity that suggested genuine psychological scarring. He spoke about watching sacred temples being desecrated, about seeing fellow priests executed for refusing to abandon their beliefs, and about the desperate final efforts to hide religious artifacts before everything was lost. These emotional responses convinced Dr. Villegas that Santiago wasn't simply reciting information he had somehow absorbed from external sources. The psychological impact of these memories was real and profound, affecting the child in ways that suggested genuine traumatic experience rather than imaginative storytelling. The depth of his grief when discussing the fall of the Incan Empire was heartbreaking to witness and impossible to fake. Word of Santiago's extraordinary case began spreading through international academic circles as Dr. Mendoza shared his findings with colleagues around the world. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and consciousness researchers from universities across Europe and North America expressed intense interest in studying the child whose memories seemed to bridge the gap between past and present. Some dismissed the reports as sensationalized folklore, while others recognized the potential implications for understanding human consciousness and the nature of memory itself. The controversy intensified when Santiago began providing information about undiscovered archaeological sites. During one particularly remarkable session, he drew detailed maps of locations where he claimed important artifacts remained hidden, waiting to be found by future generations. His sketches included precise geographical landmarks, depth measurements, and descriptions of the objects buried at each site. The accuracy of his cartographic details was astounding for someone who had never traveled beyond Lima's city limits. Dr. Mendoza faced a professional dilemma that would define the remainder of his career. Should he organize expensive excavations based on the claims of a 4-year-old child, or should he dismiss Santiago's revelations as elaborate fantasy despite their remarkable consistency with established archaeological knowledge? The decision would either validate the most extraordinary case of reincarnation ever documented, or expose him to professional ridicule for pursuing pseudoscientific investigations. The pressure mounted when Santiago began describing specific artifacts that he claimed were buried at coordinates he had provided. He spoke about golden ceremonial masks, carved jade figurines, and stone tablets inscribed with astronomical calculations that would revolutionize understanding of Incan scientific achievements. The specificity of his descriptions was remarkable, including details about the materials used, the craftsmanship techniques employed, and even the symbolic meanings encoded in decorative patterns. Carmen watched her son's transformation with a mixture of pride and terror. The shy, ordinary child she had raised was becoming a bridge between worlds, channeling knowledge from a civilization that had vanished centuries before his birth. But the psychological toll was becoming increasingly apparent. Santiago frequently woke from nightmares, crying about friends who had died in battles he should never have witnessed, and mourning the destruction of a world he claimed to remember as home. The medical team monitoring Santiago's condition noted significant changes in his neurological patterns during these episodes of apparent memory recall. Brain scans revealed unusual activity in regions associated with long-term memory storage, even though the child was accessing information he had never learned in his current lifetime. The neurological evidence suggested that Santiago's brain was somehow accessing memory patterns that defied conventional understanding of how human consciousness operates. As September approached, Dr. Mendoza made the decision that would either vindicate Santiago's claims or end the investigation entirely. He would organize a limited excavation at one of the sites the child had described, using Santiago's detailed coordinates and artifact descriptions as a guide. If they found nothing, the case would be closed as an interesting but ultimately unexplainable psychological phenomenon. But if Santiago's predictions proved accurate, it would represent the most significant validation of reincarnation claims in scientific history. The excavation site Santiago had chosen was located in the Sacred Valley, approximately 15 kilometers from Machu Picchu itself. According to the child's account, this location had served as a secret repository where priests had hidden their most precious religious artifacts during the final chaotic months before the Spanish conquest. He described the site with photographic precision, including specific landscape features, underground chambers, and even the arrangement of stones that marked the entrance to the hidden cache. The archaeological team that assembled for this unprecedented expedition included some of Peru's most respected researchers, along with international observers who wanted to witness either a groundbreaking discovery or the debunking of an elaborate hoax. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and everyone involved understood that the results would either revolutionize understanding of human consciousness or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing unscientific investigations. Santiago himself would accompany the expedition, serving as a guide to locations he claimed to remember from his previous existence as an Incan priest. The prospect of returning to the sacred valley filled the child with intense emotion, a mixture of excitement and apprehension that suggested genuine psychological connection to the landscape he had never physically visited in his current lifetime. Carmen agreed to the journey despite her fears, recognizing that only direct verification could provide answers to the questions that had consumed their lives for weeks. The morning of September 3rd, 2018 arrived with crystalline clarity over the sacred valley. Santiago stood at the edge of the archaeological camp, his small frame silhouetted against the towering Andean peaks that surrounded them. For the first time since his transformation in the hospital, the child appeared genuinely at peace. His breathing was calm, his posture relaxed, and his eyes held a serenity that had been absent during weeks of medical testing and psychological evaluation. Dr. Mendoza watched Santiago with scientific fascination mixed with personal anxiety. Everything hinged on what they would discover in the coming hours. The excavation equipment had been carefully positioned according to the child's specifications, and ground-penetrating radar had confirmed the presence of underground anomalies at precisely the coordinates Santiago had provided. But confirmation of empty spaces beneath the earth was far different from finding the specific artifacts the child had described in such vivid detail. Carmen held her son's hand as they walked toward the excavation site, feeling the cool mountain air fill her lungs. The altitude at this location was significantly higher than Lima, and she found herself slightly breathless despite their gradual ascent over the previous day. Santiago, however, seemed completely unaffected by the thin air. If anything, he appeared more energetic and alert than she had seen him in weeks, as if the mountain environment was somehow restoring him to full vitality. The archaeological team had established a perimeter around the area Santiago had designated as the primary burial site. According to his account, Incan priests had worked frantically during the final weeks before Spanish forces reached the sacred valley, racing to conceal their most sacred objects before the conquistadors could discover and destroy them. The child had described the burial process in heartbreaking detail, speaking about elderly priests weeping as they sealed away artifacts that represented centuries of accumulated spiritual wisdom. Dr. Rosa Villegas positioned herself where she could observe Santiago's reactions without interfering with the excavation process. Her psychological assessment equipment included video cameras capable of detecting micro-expressions and stress indicators that might reveal whether the child was genuinely experiencing recovered memories or unconsciously fabricating responses. The scientific protocol demanded objective documentation of every aspect of Santiago's behavior during this critical test of his claims. As the excavation team began removing the topmost layer of soil, Santiago suddenly became agitated. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by intense anxiety that manifested in rapid breathing and trembling hands. He pulled away from his mother and approached the dig site with obvious reluctance, as if approaching something that caused him genuine fear rather than excitement. "Be careful with the stones," he whispered to the lead archaeologist. The priests arranged them in a specific pattern to honor the 4 cardinal directions. "If you disturb their alignment, the spirits will be angry." His voice carried a note of genuine concern that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Yet the excavation team found themselves instinctively following his guidance. 3 hours into the dig, the team encountered the first significant obstacle. At a depth of approximately 2 meters, their tools struck what appeared to be a solid stone barrier. Santiago immediately moved closer to examine the obstruction, his small hands tracing patterns in the dirt that clung to the buried surface. "This is the seal stone," he announced with absolute confidence. "You must remove it carefully because the chamber beneath contains objects that have not seen sunlight for 500 years. The process of extracting the large stone slab required careful coordination and specialized equipment. As the barrier was slowly lifted away, a dark cavity became visible beneath. The opening revealed a carefully constructed underground chamber, its walls lined with fitted stones that demonstrated sophisticated engineering techniques. The preservation was remarkable, with no evidence of structural collapse or water damage that might have destroyed any contents. Santiago peered into the opening with an expression of profound sadness mixed with recognition. "Down there," he said softly, pointing towards specific areas within the chamber. The golden sun disk is wrapped in vicuña wool and placed beside the altar stone. The jade figurines are arranged in a circle around the water vessel, and the crystal mirrors are buried beneath layers of coca leaves that were blessed during the final ceremony. Dr. Mendoza felt his pulse accelerating as he prepared to descend into the chamber. If Santiago's predictions proved accurate, they were about to make one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Peruvian history. But if the chamber proved empty or contained objects that contradicted the child's descriptions, it would definitively end any serious consideration of his reincarnation claims. The descent into the underground chamber required portable lighting equipment and careful documentation of every surface and artifact position. Dr. Mendoza was accompanied by 2 graduate students who would photograph and catalog anything they discovered. The chamber proved to be larger than expected, with multiple alcoves carved into the walls and a central ceremonial space that showed evidence of ritual use. As Dr. Mendoza's flashlight illuminated the final alcove, his hands trembled uncontrollably. There, exactly as Santiago had described, lay a golden sun disk wrapped in vicuña wool, surrounded by jade figurines arranged in a perfect circle. The crystal mirrors rested beneath layers of coca leaves that still carried the faint aroma of ancient ceremonies. Every detail matched the child's impossible memories with surgical precision. Santiago knelt beside the chamber opening, tears streaming down his face as he whispered prayers in archaic Quechua. The excavation had validated the most extraordinary case of reincarnation ever documented, but questions remained that would haunt researchers for generations. How many other children carry memories of lives they never lived? What secrets of human consciousness remain buried in the depths of our minds, waiting to be rediscovered? Today, Santiago lives quietly with his mother in Lima, attending school like any normal teenager. But every year on August 14th, the anniversary of his awakening, he returns to the sacred valley to leave offerings at the site where his past and present finally converged. The artifacts discovered that day revolutionized archaeological understanding of Incan civilization, yet the mystery of Santiago's memories continues to challenge everything science believes about the nature of death, consciousness, and the eternal journey of the human soul. Santiago's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps death is not the end we imagine it to be, but merely a doorway between worlds that some souls remember crossing.